Well, Chris, the group has fundamentally gathered. We really appreciate you joining us. We've been spending the last couple of pandemic years visiting with both authors, including yourself, and interesting folks doing things in business technology. We had Mark Andreessen, and I know A16Z is doing investing along similar lines to anybody who reads this book would want to. The book's called The Kill Chain, which I read and thought was so awesome. I reached out to everybody's favorite former McCain person, Lee Dunn, and had her connect us. She's a rock star, as you know well, but it was a really great book. And we'll dive right into it though, as we always do. After this event, we will send a link to everybody here. We've already bought copies of Chris's book for you. We just need you to give us the mailing address and enter it in so we don't have to actually mail it to you, because that's a lot of work. It's a great book. It's really fascinating. It's the big thesis, as I can tell, is that emerging technologies are enabling new tactics, which are sort of upending warfare and how we think about warfare for the 21st century. But that you are concerned, as was the late, great Chairman McCain, that the United States is not rising to the challenge. We're too busy preparing for the last war that we may miss necessary efforts for the current war. Is that right? Did I totally misread the book? And if it's right, what inspired you to write it? And what are your big takeaways? Who do you hope reads this, and what do they do from it?
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you, Bruce, for inviting me to come on. Thank you for the kind words about the book. Thank you for buying the book. It's a real opportunity. It's a real honor to be with all of you guys, and look forward to the conversation. Why did I write the book? It was not to have fun, and it was not to have, become a wealthy and best-selling author. And I had no fun producing it, and I have not become wealthy or a best-selling author. Really in a nutshell, I think you got the thesis more or less right. I think I wrote the book as I was spending my time in government, kind of working, shoulder to shoulder with Senator McCain, just kind of looking deeper and deeper at the state of our kind of, as he used to call it, military, industrial, congressional complex, looking at what was happening technologically, many times, most of all, often kind of outside of the defense industrial base, and then looking what our, at our kind of competitors were doing. And all of that sort of rolled together, really kind of left me with the growing concern while I was in government, that we were really in sort of a bad and worsening position. And, if I could sort of sum up the problem, I believe this is a story of disruption. This is a book about disruption. And it's hard to think about and talk about disruption in the context of the United States military, which is not something that you typically think of gets disrupted. You think of it as just, dominant. When we go to war, we win big. We are laps ahead of our competition. It is not something that you think is really going to be challenged. And that ultimately was the concern that I had, kind of the takeaway that I had, sort of looking at this problem while I was in government. And it was a twofold disruption. It is a twofold disruption. On the one hand, it is a disruption that is happening to us by virtue of choices that our competitors are making. This is not like a hurricane that sort of hit us overnight unexpectedly. These are choices, kind of a deliberate strategy that China in particular has been pursuing now for 25 years to modernize and build up a military, to really call into question a lot of the underlying assumptions of the United States military, how we build the force and how we operate it. And basically, what I say in the book, and what I still believe today, is they have gotten a lot further down the road. They have made a lot more progress than I think many Americans really realize and appreciate. And this is a fundamental challenge to how the United States thinks about projecting military power, the kind of ways and means by which we would do that. We can delve deeper into that if interesting. The second disruption is technology, as you mentioned, and this is technology that's largely been similarly kind of really blown out over the past 20, 25 years, mostly in the commercial economy, mostly outside of the defense industrial base, as we've watched real advancements in big data, machine learning and artificial intelligence, low-cost robotics, kind of ubiquitous sensing, new access to space. All of these technologies together, kind of increasing levels of autonomy in many of the systems that we're using in our day-to-day lives. the sort of software revolution that, Mark Andreessen wrote back in 2011, software is eating the world. It was eating much of the world in 2011. It's eaten most of the world since then, except for the defense sector, which is largely still kind of the lamb that time forgot in that regard. So, in both of these kinds of disruptions, we have sort of a fundamental challenge to the ways and means by which we operate and sort of even conceive of military power. This is a massive problem, right? This is like we are operating a taxi cab company and Uber and Lyft have shown up on the scene. And I think the real challenge for us is how do we think about what technology can make possible, what we are going to have to do differently in terms of how we compose and operate a military to deter conflict first and foremost. And if God forbid we have to, actually engage in conflict, how that's going to go differently than the years of war games that I write about a bit in the book that Senator McCain and I would be briefed on, where it was just really bad for a really long period of time, again and again and again. I think that's the fundamental challenge facing us right now is how do we disrupt ourselves to get ahead of and kind of cope with and deal with and succeed under the conditions of disruption that we're now facing.
Well, so that's a great summary, and that's exactly what I took away happily. I was speaking to a group this morning of tech execs, asking the question there at the end whether we've now seen hard power disrupted, and whether what used to be the ultimate example of hard power was an aircraft carrier, but don't sail it too close to China these days. Let me ask you. You get into a lot of this, but so in thinking about how technology is changing warfare, oversimplistically, when I think about like World War I, it was better to be defending a position than attacking a position. The combination of barbed wire and trenches and machine guns and chemical weapons meant it was a lot easier to defend. That flipped on its head with World War II. The combination of air power and fast moving armor via blitzkrieg meant that you were in a trench, they just went around you and suddenly you had a bigger problem. Do you believe the technology has flipped it again such that defense is stronger than offense, or has that yet to be seen because, maybe drones make offense better? It's just a different kind of offense.
Yeah, this is like one of these dialectics that, we're always sort of struggling with here, right? I mean, I think in general, military tacticians would say, it's kind of, relatively easier to be the defender than being the attacker. That being said, I think there are these, kind of classic challenges in warfare, the history of warfare of, how do I hide versus, how do I, how do I find a competitor? How do I attack versus how do I defend? I mean, these are the kinds of things that technology changes, but the fundamental sort of choice or continuum is always there. It's sort of a perpetual problem. I think the way you described the difference between really the 20-year period between World War I and World War II is right. All of a sudden, you had in World War I people kind of moving, armies and militaries moving across the land, not terribly differently than the Roman legions had. And then all of a sudden, 20 years later, you had all of these different vehicles that enabled offensive warfare to really kind of overwhelm a defense that wasn't prepared for it. I would say, as I kind of look at the situation we're in right now, we've seen this proliferation over the past, 20, 25 years of better and more sensors, kind of near term as well as over the horizon, space-based, all of that. And the proliferation of kind of low-cost precision fires, the kinds of ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, increasingly hypersonic weapons that the Chinese and others are fielding. And what that's done is make it incredibly lethal to be on the modern battlefield. And I think we've seen evidence of this in recent conflicts, Ukraine, Nagorno-Karabakh before that, where it's really hard to hide. It's really hard to sort of evade detection. Once found, it's not going to be very long before, large amounts of very precise fires are kind of raining down on your position. And that's to say nothing of, kind of the non-kinetic effects, cyber, electronic warfare, other technologies that have really proliferated as well. So I would say right now, the challenge the United States military faces is that we have built a military on the basis of projecting power. And that projection of power sort of assumes a lot of things. It assumes access to forward warfighting infrastructure, land bases and sea bases, access to the electromagnetic spectrum, the ability to kind of communicate information, collect and move intelligence, command and control our forces, logistics, right? I mean, to get this mountain of metal from one side of the planet to the other and then sustain forces in combat. All of these are the things that are now coming under threat from this kind of proliferation, of the sort of precision fires complex. Now, I think the question becomes one, are there technologies that will enable us to kind of flip that paradigm, much as you suggested, so that I can get mass back on the battlefield in a way that enables me to project power in different ways at lower cost, where I'm going to lose a lot of things, but I can replenish them quickly. I do think there's a case to be made for that, as we started to look at low-cost drones, swarming operations, these types of systems. But I think part of the challenge is also, kind of operational or doctrinal, which is technology is not going to solve every problem for us. And there's a degree to which, historically, projecting power from one side of the planet to the other, right onto the doorstep of a peer competitor, that's really hard. Not many great powers have been able to do that for a prolonged period of time. And maybe the deeper question that we have to ask ourselves is, how do we actually begin to change the American way of war to be more defensive, in the ability to really blunt, a competitor's ability to project power itself? And this is kind of the, one of the conclusions I draw in the book, which is, the bad news is that projecting power is becoming harder. The good news is that if we make the right decisions, projecting power is becoming harder for everybody. And I think this is one of the, there are many lessons from the current conflict in Ukraine, but I think this is one of them. But it is to say that, this is going to be a constant sort of throttling back and forth or seesawing back and forth between, who has the advantage, the attacker, the defender, the hider, the finder. I think technology is currently advantaging the defender, but I could easily see that changing, and certainly wouldn't say that the big lesson of these technologies is defense wins, because people probably said that in 1920, and by late 1930s things looked a lot different.
That's a great point. And boy, you just teed up so many great geopolitical and foreign policy questions about, if we can't project force, what that means for allies and et cetera. But let me take a quick step back, because maybe a silver lining of otherwise a truly horrible situation is that because Russia-Ukraine's happening right now, your book has a particular interesting relevance. It did to me. I'm sure it will to everybody who hasn't yet read it. And I'm interested in, as you think about the lessons, applying them to Russia, which isn't trying to project force all the way around the world. Ukraine's their backyard. They have internal supply lines for the most part. They have, we thought, pretty high-end, high-tech forces, though it would appear on the battlefield ours are better, or at least that the Ukrainian troops are both better trained and more motivated. But I'm already beyond what I actually know. What do you take away in that confirms the things you're talking about in your book, and how much of Russia-Ukraine do you think reflects the danger of an autocratic system where people just say yes to the boss as opposed to actually build what they say they're building and train what they claim they're training?
Yeah, we could spend the rest of the time on this, right? I mean, there's so many lessons that you could take out of this. And I would use lessons very cautiously, because this war is not over. As we've seen from, Putin's recent statement about mobilization, they are doubling down, it appears. So, far be it for me to say that, the lessons are all here. I think there's still a lot more of this to come. And they go well beyond warfare. I mean, as you suggested, right? I mean, there's a lot here about the Russian sort of autocratic form of government, the sort of broader problems that they've encountered when it turns out that, you run a kleptocracy. It's not just the guy at the top who's stealing everything. It's actually everybody down the line that is too. And, then when it's time to go to war, it turns out that you don't have as much military capability as you thought you did, and everyone lies up the chain of command. There's a lot of lessons that we can kind of pull out of this, but I would say one thing to, kind of underscore here, at least where we are today. There's a chapter in the book that I refer to as defense without dominance, which to me is, I think one of the ideas that the United States is going to have to start getting its head around as we look at what China in particular is building in terms of its larger kind of modernized military, kind of what it has the, kind of the potential to do economically, militarily, technologically. I don't think we're going to be dominant. I don't think we're going to be dominant in the way that we were, in the 1990s and the early 2000s when we were just laps ahead of the competition. That sounds like a defeatist thing to say out loud. It's not. I think it's just the nature of it, the reality of it. If you just look at a sector like shipbuilding, I mean, the Chinese are spitting out ships, and it's not just cruise ships, it's warships at a rate that like we're not even close to. And I don't think we're going to be close to it because of the industrial base that they have. So, to me, it's a question of thinking differently about what our objectives are and how we're actually trying to generate deterrence. And I don't think that this is, all hope is lost, right? I do think that you can generate defense in the absence of being overwhelmingly militarily dominant. And I think that's what the Ukrainians have been doing for 7 months. They, by all accounts, right, if you just kind of looked at the order of battle before this, right, you would say, as many did, like these guys are done. What they've been able to do by, obviously being motivated, by having high morale, by being well equipped by, the United States and other Western countries, but nonetheless, with relatively lower cost forces, long range fires, loitering munitions, kind of unmanned aerial systems for spotting, kind of other things that they've been developing on the fly. They have been able to really begin grinding the Russians down. In many cases, actually starting to generate an ability to go back on the offensive themselves and retake territory. But, I guess like the point that I would call out here, which I think is germane to how we would think about a Taiwan scenario, is, projecting power is really hard. And you don't have to have, an overwhelming military advantage. You don't have to be spending, $11 trillion against the force that is coming at you. If you're prepared the right way with the right types of capabilities, you can drag this out. You can sort of generate conditions of advantage. You can win by not losing. Like these are things that I think are hopefully the broader message of this, which is, look, if we find ourselves in a conflict, we've already lost to a certain extent, right? Like the objective is to deter these kinds of conflicts. And I think one of the big lessons here, particularly as we kind of look beyond Ukraine and think about, where is the People's Republic of China going? Where's the Chinese Communist Party going? There are things that we think would be rational. Why would Vladimir Putin invade Ukraine? Why would he send, all of this military force in? What are these objectives? Their system doesn't, and his, kind of political calculations don't line up the way that ours do. So when we ask the same question in the context of Taiwan, my hope about Ukraine would be, we would be a little more cautious about, sort of being confident in the things that we think, an autocratic leader would find to be rational through his lens. And my sense is that means that we've got to be really prepared for contingencies that might seem fanciful or hard to believe for us, but in their world, there's a lot of logic dictating why they would do something like that.
Great point again. I want to reread the book at this point, which maybe I'll do. But so let me ask you this, Chris: Are we spending on the wrong things, or not spending enough on defense? There was a really good piece by Hal Brands, who was nice enough to come on here. Although I got his last book, and the brand new book is the one that seems even more interesting. So maybe we'll have to get him back. But he's super prolific on Bloomberg, and he just wrote a piece, and basically he's pointing out that we need to remember there's not only new technologies, new tactics, but the capability to produce lots and lots of it.
Yeah.
And he was pointing out how much material the US is giving Ukraine and how long it's going to take us to replenish it. And if, God forbid, we end up going toe to toe with China, a whole lot of stuff gets destroyed really fast. And even in World War II, which we all think of as America as the arsenal of democracy, it took us 3 or 4 years to really get cooking before we could generate the volume that we did. If you're advising the president tomorrow, is it more important to really scale up our capacity to just make more Stinger missiles, more javelins, and more other things, or to put the time and energy into rethinking doctrine and technology?
Yeah. Look, I mean, if I'm picking one side or the other, I think the bigger problem we have right now is not that we are not spending enough on defense, but we're not spending enough of our money on the right things. So you take munitions and weapons as an example, of what you were just suggesting with things that exist now. I mean, many of the things that we're talking about, I mean, Stinger missiles, like Ronald Reagan made those things famous. We're not talking about cutting edge technology here. When I was back in, the Senate Armed Services Committee, there was the constant refrain from the Department of Defense, and the Congress went along with it, that we were going to shortchange our munitions lines. We're not going to buy as many munitions as we thought we might need. We're going to put those monies into platforms, aircraft, vehicles, ships. And, the belief, the assumption was, if things go sideways, weapons, we can turn those things up and start spitting them out real fast. Well, we've now run that social science experiment. Turns out that didn't work out so well. And again, the things we're talking about here, Javelin missiles, Stinger missiles, HIMARS, it turns out that we actually don't have the industrial base that's capable of going from, kind of steady state competition to full blown, dealing with a crisis. And, that is despite the fact that, Joe Biden has basically become a quartermaster in the Ukrainian army, and Congress has given him a blank check, to turn this up. Like, there are certain problems that money simply cannot solve. I think, there are things that we are going to need to be doing here that really look more at how technology can change the entire paradigm of how we are producing things, right? So, we tend to focus so often on, kind of the pointy end of the kill chain and how, artificial intelligence and these things are going to change warfare. Well, there's also been a complete revolution over the past 20 years in manufacturing, in automation and manufacturing, where you look at, how, cars and other things are produced now. It's very different, than how much of our defense industrial base produces capability. So, there's this belief that, there may not be innovation happening to the degree that we would want in sort of our traditional industrial base, but boy, they can produce things at scale. And I think over the past 7 months, like that belief has been exploded in Ukraine. We can't produce things at scale, not at the scale that we're going to need. And look, I'm here to tell you that if we think we can't keep up with demand in Ukraine, like, we're not even going to come close in a Taiwan contingency or a broader, God forbid, crisis or conflict with China. And again, we're not talking about the very expensive, exquisite weapons, the LRASMs and things that we sort of hold for ourselves, as the, in case of danger and crisis, break glass U.S. military capability. We're talking about things, again, that are like relatively simple. They've been around for a long time, and they're gated for a whole lot of reasons, whether it's, the propulsion, the manufacturing, the supply chains that have basically been, elongated down to very, very small bits and pieces, single points of failure, managed more about, efficiency and ease of administration and cost reduction, not from the ability to scale up. So I don't think that the answer is necessarily spending more money. There's certain problems that more money will solve, but it's going to be over a function of time. I think the bigger problem we have is that if you actually look deeply at the defense budget, most of what we're spending money on is not weapons. It's not, the things that the Ukrainians are, using and demanding right now. It is the very big, expensive, exquisite, hard to replace military platforms, vehicles, ships, satellites, aircraft, that are going to be, really challenged in many respects in terms of, the future operating environment, where it's going to be really hard for them to project power, to penetrate, to evade detection, to survive. And if you think that it's hard to replace HIMARS on a relevant timeline, try doing that with 5th generation aircraft, and large capital ships. Like, if we lose those things, we're not just turning up production, we're not going to get more of them real fast.
All right, so you're way wired in with a lot of these folks. I'm interested in to what you were just talking about. Why do you think we have been misallocating and misdeploying funds? It could be, that a lot of the exquisite platforms are big dollar tickets. Maybe it's the traditional defense industrial base. Maybe it's members of Congress with jobs in their district. That goes hand in hand. But equally, do you think the Ukraine-Russia situation is generating the wake-up call that you obviously are perceiving? You perceived it before, which is why you wrote the book. But now everybody can see what Hal was writing about. We don't have the capacity to scale up, which is obviously one of the first things needed. Why were we in the mess? And is there enough awareness now that you think we'll be able to make the changes that we need?
Yeah, I think that the awareness is growing. I think that, there's sort of been a series of wake-up calls. Before Ukraine, it was, watching what the Azeri military was able to do to Armenia and Azerbaijan, and the ways that they kind of brought, loitering munitions and low-cost drones and these kinds of things to bear to succeed in that conflict. I think the awareness is growing. I think people, to some extent, are still somewhat frustrated and paralyzed about what to do. I think part of it is, we're still thinking the same ways about, what we mean by military power. And I think that's the answer to the question that you just asked. It's not because, people in Congress or people in the Department of Defense or people in industry are stupid or unpatriotic or, greedy war profiteers or, pick your other pejorative. I mean, by and large, these are hardworking, motivated, patriotic people who are trying to do the best inside of a system that I would contend is systemically broken. It's systemically broken in the way that we value military power. We have been dominant for so long that we have mistaken the means of our sort of historic dominance with the ways in which we are going to be dominant in the future. We've fallen in love with our own toys. And the reality here is, and this is what, why I kind of leaned into the idea of the kill chain, for kind of an organizing principle for the book. Military platforms, vehicles, ships, aircraft, big satellites, they're easy to see, right? They're easy to put your hands on. You can build them in congressional districts. They look awesome in parades. It's very easy and tactile to say, this is what military power looks like. But the reality is that, military power is really generated from this process of the kill chain, which is, in a very kind of reduced and simplified version, the ability to understand what is going on, the ability to make decisions quickly, and the ability to take actions, whether those actions result in things blowing up and acts of violence or, non-kinetic actions that generate deterrence, across that continuum. It's the same workflow. And I think it's the right way to, kind of ask the question, well, how are new technologies fundamentally going to change the way we build and operate a military? The wrong approach is what we see so often, which is, how do I drop artificial intelligence in my fighter jet from the 1980s? There might be some benefit that you can squeeze out of that, like we should probably do it. The real question is, how is this technology going to fundamentally change the way that I work? How is it going to change the way that military operators understand their environment? How does it change the way they can make decisions and communicate them to people or things that need information? And then how can we act at sort of better, bigger, faster scales where we can just constantly overwhelm a competitor? Again, whether that's in competition, crisis, or conflict. That I think is the right question, right? And all too often, I think we get it just backwards in the defense, the defense world, which is this very closed ecosystem where we're constantly sort of, speaking in acronyms and, drinking our own bathwater. The real question here is not, how do I replace a 5th generation fighter with a 6th generation fighter or a 7th generation fighter? It's how do I generate air dominance, right? The problem, what made disruption work, always work, is you have a disruptive, entity, competitor, company, what have you, that actually understands what the problem is that people are trying to solve, right? Like, if I'm in the late 1990s and I'm Blockbuster Video, my problem is not how do I have more stores to rent more movies, right? The problem is how do I get content to people who want to consume it, constantly? Like that's what Netflix figured out. That's why Blockbuster doesn't exist anymore. And I think, we are in the position of Blockbuster Video when it comes to, much of our defense industrial base and much of our defense sector and the thinking that is pervasive in it. We are being disrupted by our competitors and by technology. And unless and until we figure out how to disrupt ourselves, how to get to the essence of what we're trying to do and the problems we're trying to solve, we're never going to see those, we're never going to see ourselves accurately. We're never going to understand what these technologies can and should be doing for us. And we're going to build, if we're just building a better version of the military we have, we're not going to win in the future.
All right, so you've brilliantly diagnosed the problem. You're totally aligned, for what it's worth, with Clayton Christensen's Innovator's Dilemma, where by being so far ahead, you're disinclined to upset a world you're dominating. And usually what happens is those who are behind are motivated to disrupt, and those who lose substantially get motivated to disrupt. We don't want to get really far behind, and we desperately don't want to have a disaster of a war. How do we convince ourselves to disrupt ourselves? What's, maybe this is the revolt of the admirals, so maybe there's some history to it, but as you think about how do you actually get people to embrace it, you tell the story of being with Chairman McCain, and you guys were calling this, as was Andrew Marshall, and people aren't listening. What's the wake up call? How do we flip the switch?
So I think that the switch is being flipped. I mean, I think that, if you go back to the times that I was writing about in my book, 2015, 16, 14, 15, 16, 17, the conversations we're having now are just fundamentally different, even than the ones we were having back then. I mean, I remember in 2014, you had, senior officials in the Defense Department, being chided for referring to like an era of great power competition, and actually having the audacity to, put China in that sentence. Things have moved on, right? I mean, I think that, we're having a much different conversation about China than we were back then. We're having a very different conversation about sort of the state of our military. You kind of just look at the things that the Secretary of Defense, the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, the service chiefs, the service secretaries are saying. I think the problem is now that we understand that we have a problem, which, in sort of like, a good 12-step program, right? That is the first step toward solving your problem, is admitting you have one. I think the challenge that we have right now is, what do we do about it? That, I think, is the thing that people are struggling with. I think they're struggling genuinely, to try to figure out what that answer is. I think that the, kind of obviously recent events, war in Ukraine, first and foremost, top of mind, genuinely is starting to kind of point an answer here to say, look, we're going to have this big, expensive, exquisite military that we've built for a long time. And it's still going to be very useful to us, right? There are things that force, uniquely can and needs to do that, we have to keep making those investments. But really, I think what recent events are sort of calling out, and, kind of one of the big points that I was trying to get at in my book, is we need a totally different military, in addition to the one that we have, that has almost the mirror opposite attributes of the military we do have, right? So we need a military, an additional military that is
George Costanza military.
Yeah, exactly. The opposites day military,
right?
Like large quantities of relatively smaller, more intelligent, more autonomous, more attritable military systems, things that I can build, I can lose, I can replenish faster. Like this, in a nutshell, is what the Ukrainians are using to generate defense without dominance in their conflict with Russia. I would argue these are the kinds of things that, if Taiwan actually wants to embrace this sort of so-called porcupine strategy to make itself, so unappealing and unenticing to an invading, Chinese military that, they're able to deter conflict. And if, God forbid, conflicts happens, they can kind of like, manage to stay in the fight long enough for, reinforcements and defense to come to their aid. That, I think, is what that military is going to look like. That is a military that's going to need to be thought about, conceived of, bought, and replaced very differently. I mean, this is a consumable military. That is not something that we tend to think about, right? We tend to think about our military systems as things that we're going to invest an eye-watering amount of research and development money to generate a relatively small number of things that we're going to produce and buy, and then we're going to keep them in inventory at great expense for like 30 to 40 years. And I think the model here is like, we're still going to need those things like long-range bombers and big ships and, ICBMs. But a lot of that other military is going to be something that I am going to sort of consume and use, much like I do much of the technology I use in my day-to-day life. Like, I'm not paying, a 10-year operations and sustainment bill for my iPhone. I'm getting a better one, in 18 months when I want it or I need it. That I think, and it's, again, it's not just going to be commercial technology is going to solve this problem, because the reality is, like, the technology that the military needs, that defense, kind of requirements point to, is going to be very different than commercial technology, but it's still going to be a class of technology that you could put into this bucket of kind of a consumable item where you just need to buy a lot of it. And you need to buy it at a scale and with a regularity that you can actually begin to generate real markets for this capability, rather than the relatively closed and highly managed economy that is our defense sector in this kind of larger, more exquisite class of kind of capital assets and sort of Cold War type systems. So, I think that people are starting to get it, which is great. That's progress. The world is sort of, reinforcing a lot of these lessons and making them more urgent. I think the thing that people have not yet figured out is, like, how do we actually change? I think a lot of people are working hard on that. There are kind of, good progress in some places, but I would say systemically, we're still behind the curve.
All right, last two questions for you. First, as you look around the world, are there nations that you feel like have figured out what you've described and are trying to very much reinvent military tactics and doctrine, employ technologies, whether it's Israel or India or China or Taiwan? Who seems to get the joke at this point?
Yeah. So, I mean, rather than sort of picking out winners and losers, I mean, I would say the theme that sort of separates those are the ones that are actually closer to a fight, the ones that are actually, God help them, sort of in a conflict where they are having to deal with these things as a matter of necessity, rather than sort of talking about them, planning for the future, wargaming them, et cetera. This is the challenge that I kind of point out in my book, right? Is that everywhere else, people who are building products, going to market, figuring out how to compete, they get the benefit of immediate real world feedback, right? If nobody buys my consumer product, I've probably got a bad product market fit, probably not doing it right, probably not interesting. How do I know if my military is ready to win in a conflict? I'm not in a conflict. I can now, analyze it. I can do, tabletop exercises and war games and all of these ways that we try to see ourselves. But, what's Mike Tyson's old line? Everyone's got a plan until they get punched in the mouth. Like, getting punched in the mouth is a sobering thing. And I think when you look at the Ukrainians, when you look at the Israelis, when you look at, other actors in the Middle East that are contending with, kind of what Iran is doing in terms of how it's fielding, low-cost drones, low-cost missiles. I'd say those are the ones that are actually dealing with this problem. And I guess it's just to underscore the fact that so often we hear this problem of sort of like future warfare, future emerging technology, as if it's this thing that's coming in like the 2030s and we can, kind of get ready for. And the reality is this stuff is happening now. Like, this technology is here. And it's only going to get, more sophisticated, more impactful. But, to go back to your historical analogy, right? I mean, everyone thought in 1914, it's like, oh my God, where did all this technology come from? We got machine guns and airplanes and, all these things that we didn't have before. But the reality is those things were visible on battlefields, arguably going back to the American Civil War, to say nothing of all of the wars in, continental Europe, between, in the late 19th century. And that's, I think, what we're seeing right now is like the future of warfare is here, man. It's in Iraq and Syria, it's in Ukraine, it's in Armenia and Azerbaijan. And I'd say the people that are starting to figure out how to deal with this, how to contend with, just a highly lethal battlefield in all of its respects, and how to use these new technologies to operate differently, are the ones that are actually in the thick of a fight, or, contending with a crisis situation where they're actually having to make this stuff work in practice for their own defense.
Well, Chris, I want to end on an uplifting note so I can sleep tonight. And just as I look around, I'm always assuming DARPA still's getting it right. And I know General Berger, who, by the way, is a big fan of yours, the Commandant of the Marine Corps. It seems like he's recognized he doesn't have the core he needs for the next war. He has the core people want him to have for the last war. Where do you see pockets of genuine leadership here at home, and give us collectively hope so that we're not all buying MREs for the basement?
Yeah. So, I mean, in terms of, picking out specific items, I mean, look, DARPA does a lot of things. I would sort of generalize by saying, like, the really exciting things that DARPA is doing tends to be the things that DARPA doesn't talk about, and the things that DARPA does talk about tends to be the things that aren't necessarily that exciting. But great things are happening there and in other places. I think right now, we're fortunate to have some really phenomenal leaders, because I think at the end of the day, the answer to the question is leadership. Right? There's two ways that we can change. We can either find ourselves, in the teeth of a crisis and then sort of do this the way that America has traditionally done it, which is like figure out, once a crisis is upon us, like how do we change and, try to come out ahead. The better way, the way that I hope this goes, is that we actually have leaders with foresight and force of personality who can actually bring these institutions along behind them and make them work in different ways to generate the kinds of outcomes that we're talking about here. General Berger's a phenomenal example of that. But he's one guy. He's got a 4-year term. And, there are a lot of people, as you're probably, following along at home, former Marine Corps generals who are not terribly happy and are trying to, throw a lot of impediments in his path. I think the answer here in many respects is, like, we've got to support people like that. We have got to help them win. We have got to help them sort of drive through these impediments and realize their visions, or we're going to be changing the way that we don't want to have to, which is reactively, in a crisis. The big thing I'd say, I mean, to your point about trying to end on a note of optimism, because look, at the end of the day, I'm an optimist. Like, if I were a pessimist, I wouldn't have written a book. I would have gotten my money, stuffed it in the mattress, and like started to learn Mandarin or something. The reason I'm an optimist is because if you actually look at the advantages we have as a country, they're awesome. In terms of money, I mean, we are spending an enormous amount on defense, and the money that we're spending on defense is dwarfed by the money that is out there in capital markets, just looking to run in to invest in things that can return, good capability and profit. We have phenomenal people, as we've talked about, in government, out of government, hardworking, well-educated, entrepreneurial, motivated, critical thinking people who, I think now genuinely are starting to understand that we have a problem and are starting to get mobilized to try to solve it. We have phenomenal technology. I mean, still world-leading technology across all of these different areas that we've been talking about today. The problem we have is us. The problem is we keep blocking our own kicks and getting in our own way. Like, if I could reduce our problem to just one thing, our problem is that we're still not serious. We're not serious in the way that we were serious in the early Cold War, where we, made significant investments to do things that people did not believe were technologically feasible, and we did them. We're not serious in the way that we addressed COVID, where we spent an enormous amount of money. We put very large bets on a series of, technological gambits. And, we came out the other end with, a handful of vaccines that allowed us to beat the pandemic. That is what we do as America when we are serious. And I still don't think that we are doing that. Now, the good news, the reason I'm optimistic about that is, like, we can become serious, right? If we didn't have technology, if we didn't have money, if we didn't have great people, we'd be in a pretty bad spot. What we have to change is just our view of the world, our view of our problem, the willingness of risk that we're prepared to tolerate, and the, kind of ability to drive through a lot of the kind of traditional barriers and, kind of reluctance that our system always kicks up of, you can't do that, don't go that fast, don't be that ambitious, the problem's not that bad, the system is actually not broken, all of these things. We can move through that with the right kind of leadership, with the right level of seriousness. That's on us. Like, that is on us to control. And that's the reason I'm optimistic. It's the reason I wrote the book, to try to contribute to that sort of like growing seriousness that I do think is trending in the right direction. I don't think we're there yet. But, to me, that is like the problems of our, the problems we have are largely problems of our making, and problems of our making can be problems of our unmaking if we become serious.
Well, that's a great conclusion. I do think the will to change has to start, or at least be accompanied by a vision. And the kill chain, it offers a great rationale why. You've given everybody here a wonderful 45 minutes, but I'll be astounded if everybody doesn't now want to go out and read the whole book, because there's a lot more there. Chris Brose, thanks so much for giving us, well, thanks for writing the book. I know that was a big effort, and thanks for spending the time with all of us today. Good luck on your travels to Boston, but thanks.
Thank you, Bruce. I appreciate it. Great to be with you.